part 3 of this series on building a full stack expense tracking application with Blazor, Web API, EF Core, and SQL Server Express. So in the previous video, part 2, we built a working front end that shows the list of expenses and the total expenses, as you can see right here. Let me just increase this. So the total expenses and the list of expenses. In part 1, we created the API, but now in part 3, we'll continue to make this button work so that we can create new expenses. We can also click the button right here or the icon right here to edit our expenses, and we can finally be able to delete our expenses. So I hope this will be informative, and let's get right into the video. So the first thing we'll be doing is, you notice that there's an error here. So let's have a look at this error and try and fix it. So Control Shift I to open the developer tools. We can see here it says unhandled exception rendering component object reference not set to an instance of an object. Okay, then if we go down, it says index.razor line 25. So let's minimize this and check that out. We have index.razor opened. So let's go to line 25. Okay, so I suspect it's because expense service.expense is not initialized. To initialize it, that would mean we'd have to use our model, expense model. So first thing we'll do is go to import over here and import using statement for our Blazor expense tracker.shared.models, our model we are using for our application. So we can click save, and then we'll go back to index.razor. Right here in the code section, we're going to go ahead and add list of expense model. We've imported expense model, so it should work. Then we're just going to call it expenses because we want to put the list of expenses in this variable, but we're going to initialize it to new list of expense model. Then in this override function, we are going to just, after awaiting expense service and getting the expenses, we are going to now get our variable we just created, which is expenses, and we'll assign expense service dot expenses to it. Okay, so if we just have a look at it, if we open the expense service over here, we're talking about the property we created here, expenses, which after we get expenses async, we assign the value of the response we get to that property, expenses. Okay, so what we are doing is now assigning the value for expenses to this new variable that we've created, expenses over here. So let's save that and see if that solves the problem. Let me close it and restart and rerun the application. So rerun it. Okay, since there's still an error. Okay, sorry. I'm yet to apply it in the actual HTML. So let's just move to the line 25 where we have at expense service.expenses, and we just use expenses, which is a variable we just created. Okay, you can remove the at and just use expenses. So if we save that, that should work. Hot reload has worked, so we can let's close the developer tools and just refresh, and we shouldn't see the error again. but we still see the error. Okay, let's just rerun the application again and have a look then. Okay, so the error doesn't show up. It means that the hot reload didn't really work. Let's just check the developer tools and have a look. Okay, so the error is gone because we've now been able to instantiate our expenses. Now we can go ahead and just close the application. And the next thing we are going to do is add a way to view and also edit individual expenses. To do that, we'll need to go to our server project. Let me just close these windows. In our server project, we'll go ahead and open expense service. We'll open the interface, and here we'll need to add a new interface member, which is going to be task expense model get expense details async. And we'll need a parameter for the ID. We can save that. Then we'll open a class expense service. And in expense service, you can use control dot to implement the new interface. Okay, so that's the interface over here. Get expense details async. Let me just cut it and put it below. Okay, so we can remove the default through statement, and then we can go ahead and add the body of the method. So in here, we're going to create a variable response equal to await. Okay, first we need to add an async here because you're going to use await underscore context dot expenses dot first or default async, where e dot id equal the ID we're providing. Then we return response. Okay. Then next thing we'll do is go to our controller. So in the controllers folder, you can open expenses controller. And in here, we'll create the API endpoint for the get expense details. So we'll first put the attribute HTTP get, then we'll add a route. Okay, with the ID as a template. Then public async task action results expense model I will name it get expense details async with the parameter ID. And in the body, we're just going to create a variable response equal await underscore expense service dot get expense details async using the value ID. finally would return response. Okay, so we can go ahead and save that. Since we've added our API endpoint, we can run our application and test it. So after the application opens, we can just add Swagger to the end of our URL and open Swagger. Let's look for the get requests with the ID as part of the template. You can just click on it and try it out. So we just want to get the details for the expense with ID 1. So we can just put 1 here and execute. And we get a 200 code, and we get our response body, which is the value of that particular expense. So it's working well. Can just close this and move on. So now that we're done with the API, we can move on to the client project. So Solutions Explorer, we move to the client project and we open the iExpense service, the interface over here, and also add interface member, task, expense, model. I'm going to name it again, get expense details async with ID as a parameter. Save that and open. Let me close this command prompt. Okay, so we're done with the interface, and then in the service itself, we can just implement the interface. Let me just cut it from here and place it below. Then I remove this default throw statement and add a variable response equal await. So if you're adding await, let's make sure that this is async. So await underscore http dot get from JSON async. The type is expense model. And in here we'll add $/API /expenses /ID. Close, and then semicolon. Then we finally just return response. We could go ahead and save. Then the next thing we'll do is add a new page. So in our pages folder, you can right click, click add, Blazor component. Then we're going to name that page expense form. And in here, on top over here, we'll add a page directive. So at page, then the route should be /expense /ID :int. Close the curly braces. Then we'll add another route at page. This time, if the user goes to /expense, it should also open the same form or the same page. Okay, so the thing is, sorry, this should not be IN, it should be ID. Sorry about that. So to provide a value for the ID, But if a user clicks on the icon for adding a new expense, it will open the page and it will not provide the value for ID, meaning it will just open /expense, and that will be an empty form which can be filled. Okay, so now let's go ahead and create the form. So we use the element edit form. Now we want to add a model for this edit form. Expense. Then we also want to add the onSubmit function. We're going to call it handle submit. Okay, now before we go any further, we want to add these variables in our code section. So first off, we actually need to add a parameter, which is ID. So we just use the attribute parameter, then public int ID, get and set. Then for our expense, public expense model, call it expense. Also get and set. We'll initialize it to new expense model. And then we can go ahead and add private async void handle submit. Okay, no parameters. But in here, okay, private. Okay, so in here, what we are going to do is await. Okay, you can just leave the body empty for the meantime. And let's get back to creating the rest of our form. So we'll first add a div. And we can, let me just copy and paste some styles over here. Okay, so basically display flex, the flex direction should be column, and the max width should be 500 pixels. Then in here, we'll have a label. And the label will be for title. We can put a text in here to be title. And then just below that, we add input text. The ID will be what we use up there, which is title with a small t. Then we use at bind dash value equal. So we are binding it to expense, that's the model, dot title. We can close that. And we can just copy and paste this for the other input. So the second one is also going to be an input text, but the name is going to be, it's going to be for description. The text is also going to be description. The ID here is also going to be description. And it's going to be expense dot description. We can paste it again, but this time we are doing it for amount. Dot amount. Then For amount, instead of input text, very important, we need to use input number instead of input text, because this is a number. Then I think we will need to update our created at, because that will be set when the expense is created. But finally, we need to add our button. Okay, so button type is going to be submit, and then style, we'll just add margin top to be 32 pixels. Then we also add a width of 150 pixels. And we can add the text, which will just be submit. And then we just close the button. Okay, so we can go ahead and save that. And I'm seeing an error here. It says a new expression requires expense form eraser. Okay, so I think there should be parentheses here before the semicolon. Okay, so like we just want to run this and have a look at what it looks like in our front end. So after it's done loading, we can see that if we just add /expense, which is the route we added, we can see that we have our form right here and it's looking okay. So we can close that. Make sure we close this also. And in here, we can come and work on the handle submit. So the first thing we need to do actually is, because when we submit, we need to access our service, is actually to inject expense service into this form. So expense service, and we're just going to call it expense service. Now, if you're wondering, this is the interface and this is the name we want to call it. So at any time, we could call it any name we want, but we just use expense service. So that when we call it in our application, this is the name we use. So this name is any name that we choose. Okay. So in here, we can now go ahead and use await expense service dot edit expense async. And then here we'll take expense, which is our model, then the expense dot ID. So I think that's self-explanatory. Then we'll add this right here, state has changed. And then we can save that. And then we actually need to make sure that anytime the parameter is set, which is the ID, we actually get the value for expenses, so that if we are trying to edit, it can be used to populate the form. You understand? So what we need to do is add this method called protected override. We actually want to override it. Async task on parameter set async, no parameters, and then here whatever here will be run when the parameter is set, also if there's a value for the parameter. So what we want to do in here is just get a value for expense. So what we are going to do is just await expense service dot get expense details async. Then we put the value of ID here. Okay, sorry, this should be on parameters set async. Okay, so we can save that. Then the next thing we'll do is actually add an on-click listener to each item in a list of expenses. So to do that, we'll need to go to index.razor, so we can open it. And inside index.razor, we'll go to the section where we have our expenses in creating the list using the for each statement. So in here, we'll go to the section where, or the place where the icon for the edit button is. So I think that will be this place right here. And then over here, we'll add an on-click listener here. So at on-click, then we'll add the method. So it's a callback method. And it's basically just going to have open edit form as the name of the method. And we're going to put the value of the expense ID. So that's going to be expense dot ID. And then also over here, we just want to add the cursor. Okay, so we can save that, and then we'll come and create the open form method down here. So we can just go private async void open form. Sorry, open edit form. I'm going to put in ID. So basically, since we have a route for this thing, we'll just want the route to be changed to /expense, and then we'll put the ID in. So to do that, we need to inject navigation manager. Okay, and we're going to call it navigation manager. Okay, so down here, what we'll do is navigation manager dot navigate to and add expense /ID navigation manager. Okay, so navigation manager dot navigate to expense/ID. So we can go ahead and save this and test it out. So when the application opens, you can see our list of expenses. When we click right here where we added on click listener, it should go to expense / the ID of that particular expense. Then it opens and we have the data all in here. So that's great, and it's working perfectly. So we can close that and move on. The next thing we need to do is to be able to add or create from the top over here where we have our icon for the add. Let me just close this. Okay, so where we have the icon for adding our new expense, we'll change this href so that it goes to /expense. Okay, so when it's clicked, it's just going to take us straight to /expense, which will open this form right here. So now next thing we'll do is go to expense form.razor. Then we'll check, we have to check the ID parameter that we get and check if it's 0. And if it's 0, we'll go ahead. If it's not 0, then we can go ahead and get the expense details. If it's not 0, then it means that we actually have a value. So you can just go with if ID is not equal to 0, that means there's no ID, then we can now set the value for expense. Okay, if not, then we do nothing. Okay, so now in handle submit to, we want to do a similar thing where we first have to check if the ID is equal to 0, equals 0. Then what we are going to do is we are going to await expense service dot create expense async. Okay, so if it's equal to 0, when we click the submit button, we'll create a new expense with the values we've added to the submit button. Else, we can now edit. So we can cut this and put it right here. Then finally, after that is done, we'll need to navigate back to the home page. Okay, so to navigate, we actually need to bring in or inject a navigation manager. I'm going to call it navigation manager. So basically we just have navigation manager dot navigate to, then in here we put our /, finally close with our semicolon. We can click save, then test this out. Okay, so after the application opens, we can come over here, and this is where we added the href. So when we click it, it should take us to expense, and we can add a new expense. Let's add bought a piano. Okay, a great gift. Then we can set the price or the amount to 1,000 and click submit. Okay, so if we click submit, it's added over here. Bought a piano. Okay, and okay, to edit it too, we can just click the edit button and change this from piano to guitar, and then we can over here, instead of 1,000, we make that maybe 300, then click submit. Okay, it's not working. Okay, so that's not working. Let's check what the problem might be. So we know the API is working, so this should be something to do with maybe our expense service on our front end. So let's just okay, but everything looks good here. Let's get back to our expense form. Let's look at the handle submit. This works because we get our expense details when we click here, so that works. But when we come here to handle our submit, we're having an issue. Okay, so let's just try and create a new expense. I think that worked too. So, but let's just try it again. Okay, let's say pay tax, and then let's just say 400. Let's submit that. Okay, so we can add, but then the problem is with our edit expense. Okay, so let's check the service again. Look at the edit expense. Okay, so I know the issue. we are supposed to put in here a $sign so that this string is able to contain a variable in it, so that this becomes valid. So let's go ahead and save that. Let's close the app and rerun it. So when the application opens, we can try and edit again. So we go in here, click that, maybe change this to pay for lunch, and then change this to maybe 80, or let's say 30, and then let's submit. Okay, so that works, pay for lunch, and then the amount also changes, so that's great. Just adding the $sign here makes this variable work and valid instead of it just being a straight string, so that's great. Now the next thing we need to do is to work on the delete section of our application. So the first thing we'll do is go to our expense service over here, and we'll actually need to implement this remove expense. Okay, so in remove expense, we are basically going to await underscore http dot delete async, and in here let's not forget the $sign again, dollar and slash API slash expenses slash, then we put our ID in here, close the quote marks, then finally we put our semicolon. So sorry about this typo, so it should be await, and in here it should be async. Okay, so you can go ahead and save that. And then the next thing we'll have to do is go to index.razor. Okay, let's stop this and let's close these two. Okay, so as I said, next thing we'll need to do is go to index.razor and go to the section or the place where the delete button is, and in here we'll add the on-click listener like we added for the edit button. So add at on-click, equal delete expense. And then in here we'll need expense dot ID. I think with this our cursor is already a pointer, so we can just go in here and create the new function delete expense. So it's just going to be private async void delete expense, and then in here parameter will be ID, and the first thing we'll do is await expense service dot remove expense, then we'll put in the ID as expected. The next thing we'll do is now await expense service dot get expenses async. So as you deleted an expense, we want to get all the expenses, then we'll go ahead and actually assign the value of what the after getting the expenses, would now like to reassign the value for expenses like we did here. So expenses equal expense service dot expenses column. Then we add state has changed. You can go ahead and save. Let's test it out. So after the application opens, let's try and delete pay for lunch right here at the bottom. Okay, so that works, and then updates immediately over here because we get the new expense async and we put the value for expenses and we change the value for expenses. That will quickly update it in the list. Okay, and then when we use states has changed, that also helps. So I think that's working great. Okay, so I have actually noticed an issue here, a bug. You can realize if you look at this bot a piano that I created, we are getting a strange date value over here. So let's just add a new one and see. Let's say bought a computer. Then let's just have it for $500. Submit. We can see that it just gives this weird date here, not the current date. So we have to try and fix that. So to fix that, we'll need to go, let me close this so that it doesn't interfere. Okay. So to fix that, we'll need to go all the way to where our expense is created in our server. So expense services right here. And look at the create expense function. We need to change the value of the created at over here. So we can just say expense. So the expense that's provided over here, we need to pick that expense and we create that expense dot created at and then set the value for the created at. So created at should be equal to datetime.utc now. So before we go into the context and add it, we'll set the value for expense.created at to be UTC now. Okay, now let me just check the model and see if there's anything else we need to set. So no, the ID is set automatically, the title we can type, the description we can type, the amount we can type, but the created at is what we set here. Okay, so let's go ahead and save and run and see if it's working properly. Okay, so let's add a new expense, and here we can just add bought a snack and just have it being maybe $5. Then we submit and we have our correct time and date showing up right here. So that's great, but if we look at our application again, we realize that every new expense we add is added at the bottom. I want things to be rearranged so that the expenses are added at the top and the newer expenses are on top and older ones are below. So to do that, in this same expense.service where we get expenses async, we are going to put dot order by. So we are going to order by descending e, where e, we're going to use e dot created at. So we are going to use the date and then we are going to make it to list async. Okay, I'm just putting a comment here. We use time to order list of expenses. So we can go ahead and save that, and then we can test it out again. Let me close this and run the application. So after the application runs, we can realize that our newer expenses are added at the top. If we add a new one, a new expense, let's just name it new expense. Just click submit, and we have it at the top here. So that's great, and I think our application is well and done. There's so many things we can also do. We can create categories, categorize the different expenses, and do so many other things. Create other pages where we can even view our expenses and graphs and other things. But maybe you can go ahead and try that. But for the scope of this tutorial, this is where we'll end it. And I hope you have learned a lot from this, and this can help you when you want to build other applications using Blazor. Have a great day. Thank you for your time.